The electrical storm hit Kepler 442c like the planet's dying breath. Violent, desperate, and utterly merciless. Captain Jake Morrison hunched over the controls of his cargo shuttle Meridian, watching purple lightning tear across the rust-colored sky while his instruments screamed warnings at him. The mining outpost below looked like a collection of metal scabs on the planet's scarred surface, barely visible through the electromagnetic chaos. "Control, this is Morrison. I'm going to have to wait this one out," he transmitted. Though static ate half his words. The storm would pass, they always did on this godforsaken rock, but not for another few hours. His supply run to the outer colonies would have to wait. Jake had been flying freight runs for 12 years, ever since he'd mustered out of the colonial Navy. He'd seen storms, pirates, and equipment failures that would make most pilots wet themselves. But something about this place always made his skin crawl. Maybe it was the way the wind howled through the abandoned mining towers, or how the red dust seemed to cling to everything like dried blood. He was settling in for a long wait when movement caught his eye near the restricted landing zone. Through the swirling dust and intermittent lightning, he glimpsed a figure hunched against the storm's fury. Jake frowned, checking his scanners. The military section was supposed to be automated. No personnel stationed planetside. Another flash of lightning illuminated the scene more clearly, and Jake's breath caught. It wasn't human. The figure was smaller than a person, with a distinctly alien silhouette, crouched low against what looked like a cargo container. But what struck him most was the absolute stillness of the pose. Not the hurried movement of someone seeking shelter, but the defeated posture of someone who had simply given up. Against every regulation in the book, Jake grabbed his storm gear and headed for the airlock. The wind nearly knocked him flat the moment he stepped outside, driving grit into every exposed surface. He pulled his goggles down and pushed through the howling chaos, following the intermittent glimpses of the figure when lightning revealed the landscape. As he got closer, details became clearer. The alien was female, her skin a pale blue-gray that seemed to shimmer despite the dust coating everything. She wore what had once been a military-style uniform, now torn and stained with something darker than dirt. Her head was tilted upward, watching the storm-darkened sky with an expression Jake had seen too many times in the mirror after particularly brutal missions. "Hey," he called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You need help." She turned toward him, and Jake felt something twist in his chest. Her eyes were large and luminous, colored like amber shot through with gold, and they held a depth of pain that seemed to reach right through him. She had 2 arms, 2 legs, 5 fingers on each hand, humanoid enough that the grief in her expression translated perfectly. "Did they leave you?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer from the way she looked at the empty sky. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, so quietly, he almost missed it over the storm. "I wasn't worth the fuel, though I..." Words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd heard plenty of hard luck stories in his years running freight to the outer colonies, but something about the way she said it, with such matter-of-fact despair, made his jaw clench with sudden anger. "Well, I think you're worth getting out of this storm," he said, extending his hand. "Come on." She stared at his outstretched palm for several heartbeats, as if she'd forgotten what kindness looked like. When she finally reached out, her fingers were cold even through his gloves, and he could feel the tremor in her grip. Jake helped her to her feet, noting how she favored her left side and the way her breath hitched with pain. Whatever had happened, here, she was hurt. The rational part of his mind cataloged all the regulations he was about to break, harboring an alien of unknown origin, interfering with what might be military operations, failing to report contact with non-human entities. The rest of him didn't give a damn. The walk back to his shuttle felt like miles, though it couldn't have been more than a few hundred meters. She leaned heavily on his arm, her steps uneven but determined. Jake found himself admiring her resilience even as he wondered what the hell had happened to leave her stranded in this wasteland. Once inside the Meridian, she stood dripping storm dust and something that might have been blood onto his deck plates, looking around with those luminous eyes as if she'd forgotten what safety felt like. Jake sealed the airlock and activated the atmospheric cleaners, watching her carefully. "I'm Jake," he said, keeping his voice gentle. Jake Morrison. What's your name? Kira, she whispered, her voice carrying a musical quality despite its roughness. Kira Veltar of the... She paused, something painful flickering across her features. Of nowhere, I suppose. Jake felt that twist in his chest again. Whatever had happened to her, whoever had left her behind, they'd torn something fundamental away from her. The way she held herself spoke of military training, but the defeat in her posture suggested something far more personal than a simple abandonment. Well, Kira Veltar, he said, moving to the medical supplies locker, you're somewhere now, and nobody's leaving you behind on my watch. For the first time since he'd found her, something flickered in those amber eyes that might have been hope. The storm had passed by the time Jake got the Meridian airborne, leaving Kepler 442c's scarred surface gleaming dully in the pale morning light. Kira sat in the co-pilot's chair, staring out at the receding planet with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. She'd barely spoken since coming aboard, answering his questions with nods or single-word responses. Haven Station's about 18 hours out, Jake said, adjusting their course. We'll get you medical attention there. Figure out what comes next. Kira's hand moved unconsciously to her side where dark stains had seeped through her torn uniform. Medical attention, she repeated softly, as if the concept was foreign to her. You're hurt, Jake pointed out. That looks like more than just a scrape. For the first time since boarding, she looked directly at him. My people have different ideas about medical treatment than yours, I suspect. There was something in her tone that made Jake's stomach tighten. He'd heard that same careful neutrality from trauma victims before, people who'd learned that showing pain only made things worse. Want to tell me what happened back there? He asked gently. Kira was quiet for so long that Jake thought she wouldn't answer. Then she began unfastening her uniform jacket with careful, deliberate movements. I was born defective, she said matter-of-factly. The Zephyrian Collective has no use for defective units. Jake started to respond, then stopped short as she shrugged out of the jacket. Her pale, blue-gray skin was marked with an intricate network of scars, some old and silvered, others still pink with recent healing. They weren't random injuries. They were precise, methodical, following patterns that suggested medical procedures rather than battle wounds. Jesus, Jake breathed. Corrective treatments, Kira explained, her voice clinical. Attempts to suppress the emotional irregularities that made me unsuitable for service. When those failed, she gestured toward the viewport, toward the planet they'd left behind. Disposal was deemed more efficient than continued investment. Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. They tortured you. They tried to fix me. Kira began examining a particularly nasty wound along her ribs, probing it with practiced fingers. I was a strategic analyst for the Collective's military division. Quite good at it, actually. But I had an unfortunate tendency to consider the emotional and psychological factors of our enemies. I would recommend strategies that minimize casualties on both sides when possible. That sounds like good strategy to me. Kira's laugh held no humor. The Collective doesn't wage war to minimize casualties, Captain Morrison. They wage war to demonstrate dominance. My empathy was classified as a severe psychological disorder. Jake stood up, moving to the medical kit mounted on the bulkhead. Here, let me look at that wound. You don't need to. Yes, I do. The firmness in his own voice surprised him. You're bleeding on my ship, which makes it my problem. More importantly, you're in pain, which makes it my choice to help. Kira studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Jake knelt beside her chair, opening the medical kit and pulling out antiseptic and bandages. This close, he could see the fine details of her alien features, the subtle ridges along her cheekbones, the way her skin seemed to have a faint luminescence even in the ship's artificial light. This might sting, he warned, applying antiseptic to the wound. Kira's intake of breath was sharp but controlled. You're very gentle, she observed. Is this typical human behavior? I'd like to think so. Jake worked carefully, noting how she held herself perfectly still despite what had to be considerable pain. Though I'll admit, Most humans haven't had much practice treating wounded aliens, and most Zephyrians haven't experienced kindness from other species. Kira's voice had grown softer. We're taught that aliens are either enemies to be conquered or resources to be exploited. Jake paused in his work. What do you think now? I think, Kira said slowly, that my people's definition of defective might be flawed. Their eyes met, and Jake felt something electric pass between them. Up close, Kira's amber eyes held depths he could lose himself in. The clinical detachment she'd maintained was cracking, revealing something vulnerable and achingly beautiful underneath. Tell me about your world, Jake said, resuming his careful bandaging. Before the collective decided you were broken. A small smile ghosted across Kira's lips, the first real expression of pleasure he'd seen from her. Zephyr Prime has 3 moons, she said. During certain alignments, they create tidal pools that glow with bioluminescent organisms. I used to sneak out as a child to watch them dance in the water. Sounds beautiful. It was forbidden, of course. Aesthetic appreciation serves no tactical purpose. But her eyes had taken on a distant, dreamy quality. I would lie on my back in the sand watching the moons and the dancing lights and imagine what it would be like to explore other worlds, to see how other species found beauty in their environments. Jake finished securing the bandage but found himself reluctant to move away. Maybe you'll get that chance now. Perhaps. Kira's hand came up to rest lightly on his where it lingered near her ribs. Her skin was warm despite its alien pallor, and Jake felt his breath catch at the simple contact. Jake? Yeah? Thank you for seeing me as worth saving. The simple gratitude in her voice made Jake's chest tighten. Without thinking, he reached up to brush a strand of silver-white hair from her face. Kira leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering, closed for just a moment. An alarm chimed from the pilot's console, breaking the moment. Jake reluctantly pulled away, checking the displays. His blood chilled as he read the sensor data. We've got company, he said grimly. 3 ships, closing fast. Configuration matches collective military vessels. Kira was on her feet instantly, all traces of vulnerability vanishing. They found us. How is that possible? We're in neutral space. I'm property of the collective, Kira said simply. They don't recognize neutral space when it comes to retrieving stolen assets. Jake's hands flew over the controls, pushing the Meridian's engines to maximum burn. Well then, let's see how badly they want their property back. As the ship lurched forward under increased acceleration, Jake caught sight of Kira gripping her chair, her face pale but determined. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, and Jake found himself willing to take on the entire collective, if it meant keeping this remarkable woman safe. The stars streaked past as they fled into the darkness, hunters on their trail and an uncertain future ahead of them. The collective ships gained ground steadily despite Jake's best efforts. The Meridian was built for cargo, not speed, and her pursuers were military-grade hunters designed for exactly this kind of chase. They're hailing us, Jake said, his hands dancing across the controls as he weaved between the massive asteroids of the Kepler belt. Don't answer, Kira said sharply. They'll try to override your ship's systems remotely. Can they do that? Collective technology is designed to assume control of any vessel when necessary. Kira's fingers flew over the co-pilot's console with practiced efficiency. But I can try to block their attempts. Jake threw the Meridian into a spiraling dive around a particularly large asteroid, using its gravity well to slingshot them toward the belt's inner edge. Behind them, the pursuing ship split up, trying to flank them through the debris field. There, Kira pointed to a cluster of industrial structures clinging to a massive asteroid. Sigma 7 mining station. It was abandoned 3 years ago when the ore deposits played out. Can we lose them there? Maybe. The station's still powered, minimal life support in the administrative sections. Jake didn't hesitate. He angled the Meridian toward the station's docking bay, pushing the ship's engines past their recommended limits. The pursuing vessels were close enough now that he could see their weapon systems charging on his tactical display. The docking bay was a tight fit, designed for smaller mining shuttles, but Jake managed to squeeze the Meridian through with meters to spare. The moment they touched down, he was killing all non-essential systems, hoping to minimize their thermal signature. "They'll scan the station," Kira said. "We need to get to the lower levels, somewhere with heavy metal interference." They grabbed emergency supplies and headed deeper into the abandoned facility. The mining station was a maze of corridors and industrial machinery, all coated with the fine dust that accumulated in low-gravity environments. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as they made their way toward the excavation levels. Here, Kira found a maintenance alcove behind a massive ore processor. "The electromagnetic interference from the old equipment should mask our biosigns." The space was cramped, barely large enough for 2 people. Jake found himself pressed against Kira's side, acutely aware of her warmth and the subtle scent of her skin. Above them, they could hear the distant sound of the hunters' ships landing. "How long before they find us?" Jake whispered. "Hours, maybe less." Kira's voice was steady, but Jake could feel the tension in her body. "They're very thorough." Minutes passed in tense silence. Then Kira began to shake, just a slight tremor at first, then more violently. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. "Kira, what's wrong?" "Can't," she gasped. "Too small. Too closed in. They used to—" Her words dissolved into panicked breathing. Jake understood immediately. The torture she'd endured had left her claustrophobic. Being trapped in the tiny space had triggered a panic attack. "Hey, look at me," Jake said softly, taking her face in his hands. "You're not there. You're here, with me. You're safe." Kira's amber eyes were wide with terror, but she focused on his face. "I can't breathe," she whispered. "Yes, you can. Breathe with me." Jake took a slow, deliberate breath, holding her gaze. In and out. That's it. Gradually, her breathing slowed to match his. The trembling subsided as she anchored herself to his voice, his touch, his presence. "I'm sorry," she said when she could speak again. "I'm weak, broken, just like they said." "No." Jake's voice was fierce. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. You survived things that would have destroyed most people. You're not broken, Kira. You're magnificent." Something shifted in her expression. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else. Wonder, gratitude, and a growing warmth that had nothing to do with their cramped quarters. "You truly believe that?" she said. Not a question, but a statement of amazement. "I do." Kira's hand came up to cover his where it rested against her cheek. "On Zephyr Prime, we have a saying. The heart recognizes what the mind cannot comprehend. I never understood it before." "What do you understand now?" Instead of answering with words, Kira leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to want this. But when Jake responded, pulling her closer, it deepened into something desperate and hungry. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Jake rested his forehead against hers, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. "I've never," Kira whispered. "The collective doesn't. Physical intimacy is considered a distraction from duty." "Then they're idiots," Jake said, earning a soft laugh from her. What's between us? This is what makes life worth living." Kira's hands moved to the fastenings of his jacket, her fingers trembling slightly. "Show me," she said. "Show me what they tried to take from me." Jake's breath caught. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." What followed was a revelation for both of them. Jake had known passion before, but nothing like this. The way Kira responded to his touch as if she was discovering her own capacity for pleasure. Every caress, every kiss was a reclamation of her stolen humanity. Kira's skin was like silk beneath his hands, and the soft sound she made drove him to worship every inch of her with his mouth and fingers. When she arched beneath him, crying out his name, Jake felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This wasn't just desire, it was something far deeper and more permanent. Afterward, they lay entwined in the narrow space, her head on his chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her. "I understand now," Kira said softly. Why they were so afraid of what I represented. This connection, this capacity for love, it makes you question everything they teach about the expendability of individuals. You're not expendable, Jake said firmly. Not to me. Never to me. A metallic clang echoed through the station, followed by the sound of boots on metal decking. Their pursuers had found them. Time to go, Jake said, helping Kira dress quickly. But as they prepared to run again, he caught her hand. Whatever happens, I want you to know. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Kira's smile was radiant despite their dire circumstances. The feeling is mutual, Jake Morrison. Now let's make sure we live long enough to explore it properly. They slipped out of their hiding place and deeper into the station's bowels, the sound of pursuit growing closer behind them. But Jake no longer felt like they were just running from something. They were running toward a future together, whatever it might bring. The hunting party cornered them in the station's main processing center, a vast chamber filled with dormant machinery and ore conveyors. Jake counted 6 Zephyrians in military gear, their weapons trained on him and Kira as they emerged from behind a massive sorting mechanism. Unit designation Kira Veltar, the lead hunter announced, his voice carrying the same clinical detachment Jake had heard in Kira's earlier description of her treatment. You will return to custody for final processing. I am no longer a unit of the collective, Kira replied, her voice steady despite the weapons pointed at her. I renounce my designation. The hunter's expression didn't change. Defective units cannot renounce their designation. You will comply. Like hell she will. Jake stepped forward, placing himself between Kira and the soldiers. She's under the protection of the Colonial Defense Force. A new voice cut through the tension. How touching. The defective unit has found herself a pet. The hunters parted to reveal their commander, a tall Zephyrian with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Unlike the others, his uniform bore the distinctive markings of the collective's psychological reconditioning division. Commander Vextar, Kira whispered, and Jake heard the fear in her voice. Yes, my dear failed experiment. Did you think we would simply allow you to contaminate other species with your emotional instabilities? Vextar's cold gaze shifted to Jake. And you, human, you have interfered with collective property. The penalty is death. She's not property, Jake said, his hand moving slowly toward the sidearm at his hip. She's a person with rights. Rights? Vextar laughed, the sound like breaking glass. She is a malfunctioned tool. We invested considerable resources attempting to repair her defects. When that proved impossible, disposal became necessary. Jake felt Kira tense behind him. What defects? He asked, though he was fairly sure he knew the answer. Empathy, compassion, the inability to view other sentient beings as expendable resources. Vextar spoke as if describing a disease. She would weep for enemy casualties. She would recommend strategies that prioritized preservation of life over tactical advantage. Utterly useless. Those aren't defects, Jake said. Those are the things that make her better than all of you. Amusing philosophy from a species that will soon be extinct. Vextar raised his weapon. But enough discussion. Unit Veltar, step away from the human. Your reconditioning will be completed en route to the homeworld. No. Kira's voice was quiet but firm. She stepped out from behind Jake, standing at his side. I won't go back to being your broken tool. You have no choice. Everyone has a choice, Jake said. That's what separates people from tools. The standoff stretched taut. 6 military-grade weapons against Jake's single sidearm, and whatever courage Kira could muster. Jake calculated angles and distances, knowing their odds were virtually nil but unwilling to surrender without a fight. That's when Kira surprised everyone. You want to know what's really defective? She said, addressing her former commander. A society that throws away its most valuable members because they're inconvenient. You call me broken, but I see patterns you miss. I understand motivations you ignore. I can predict behavior you can't comprehend. Irrelevant, Vextar said, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was listening. Is it? You've spent 3 years hunting down defective units like me. How many have you caught? A flicker of something, annoyance, uncertainty, crossed the commander's features. 47 attempts, Kira continued. 11 successful recoveries. The rest escaped to territories beyond your reach. You want to know why? Because you can't understand why anyone would risk everything to help a stranger. You can't predict the actions of people who choose compassion over self-interest. Jake began to understand what she was doing. Kira was using her greatest weapon, her ability to see the psychological patterns her captors couldn't grasp. You came here expecting to find a cowering, broken tool ready to submit to recapture, she said. Instead, you found someone who chose to stand and fight alongside a human who had no logical reason to protect her. That's the defect you can't fix, Vextar. The ability to inspire loyalty through love instead of fear. The commander's jaw tightened. Enough. You will return to custody. Or what? You'll kill me? Then you'll have to explain to the High Command why you destroyed valuable intelligence about human psychology and strategic thinking. Kira's voice grew stronger. I've learned more about this species in 2 days than your entire intelligence division has gathered in years. Jake saw the moment of hesitation in Vextar's eyes and knew Kira had found her mark. The collective might consider her defective, but they also understood the value of intelligence. Besides, Jake added, you're in colonial space now. Fire on us and you'll have the entire defense force hunting you down. It was a bluff. They were in disputed territory at best, but the combination of Kira's psychological pressure and the threat of military consequences gave the hunters pause. This is not over, Vextar said finally. The collective will reclaim its property. Good luck with that, Jake replied. In the meantime, I suggest you get off this station before I decide to report this little incursion to Colonial Command. The standoff held for several more heartbeats, then Vextar signaled his troops to withdraw. As they filed out of the processing center, the commander paused at the threshold. You cannot run forever, Veltar. We will find you. Maybe, Kira said, but I won't be running alone. After the hunters left, Jake and Kira waited in tense silence until they heard the sound of ships departing. Only then did Jake allow himself to breathe. That was incredible, he said, pulling Kira into his arms. The way you turned their own psychology against them. I learned from the best, she said, melting into his embrace. A certain human who taught me that standing up for what's right is worth any risk. Jake kissed her then, pouring all his relief and admiration and growing love into the contact. When they broke apart, Kira's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I've never had anyone fight for me before, she whispered. Get used to it, Jake said. Because I'm not going anywhere. They made their way back to the Meridian, hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The hunt wasn't over. Jake knew they'd be looking over their shoulders for a long time to come. But they'd faced down the collective's best and emerged victorious. More importantly, they'd found something worth fighting for in each other. As they lifted off from the mining station, Jake set course for the Outer Rim territories where colonial law held sway. It would be a long journey, but they'd make it together. Where to now? Kira asked, settling into the co-pilot seat. Haven Station first, Jake said. Then we'll see what the universe has in store for us. Kira smiled, reaching over to take his hand. I'm ready for whatever comes next. And as the stars wheeled past the viewport, Jake knew that whatever challenges awaited them, they'd face them as partners. The defective unit had found her place in the universe, and Jake had found his purpose in protecting her. Together, they were unstoppable. Haven Station hung in the void like a mechanical flower, its rotating sections creating artificial gravity for the thousands of souls who called it home. Jake guided the Meridian through the traffic control patterns, feeling a sense of relief he hadn't experienced in days. This was colonial space protected by treaty and defended by people who understood the value of individual freedom. It's beautiful, Kira breathed, watching the station's lights twinkle against the star field. So many different ships, so many species living together. Welcome to the frontier, Jake said. Where what you do matters more than where you come from. The docking procedures were routine, but Jake's heart hammered as they waited for the customs official to review their documentation. Kira sat beside him, her forged transit papers identifying her as a Zephyrian defector seeking asylum. It was technically true, even if the paperwork was somewhat creative. Purpose of visit? The customs official asked, barely glancing up from her tablet. Delivering cargo and requesting asylum consideration for my passenger, Jake replied. Duration of stay? Indefinite. The official looked up then, taking in Kira's alien features and the way she sat close to Jake. Asylum, huh? Political or personal? Both, Kira said quietly. I was deemed ideologically incompatible with collective doctrine. Well, you're in good company. Half the people on this station are running from something. The official stamped their papers with practiced efficiency. Report to Colonial Services on Deck 7 if you want to make the asylum formal. Welcome to Haven. 6 months later, Jake stood on the observation deck of their new quarters, watching the stars wheel past the station's viewports. The asylum hearing had been a formality. Colonial law was clear about protection for political refugees, and Kira's intelligence about collective operations had made her a valuable asset rather than a burden. You're brooding again, Kira said, slipping her arms around his waist from behind. Just thinking about how much has changed. Jake leaned back against her warmth, marveling at how natural this felt. 6 months ago, I was just another freight pilot. Now you're a freight pilot with a very grateful alien girlfriend, Kira finished, her breath warm against his ear. Jake turned in her arms, struck as always by how beautiful she was. The stress lines around her eyes had faded, replaced by lines from the joy she'd discovered in her new life. Her work as a counselor for other refugees had given her purpose, a way to use her empathy as a strength rather than a weakness. Girlfriend seems like an inadequate word, Jake said, reaching into his pocket for the small box he'd been carrying for weeks. Kira's eyes widened as he dropped to one knee. Jake, what are you? Kira Veltar, he said, opening the box to reveal a ring crafted from rare metals mined in the Kepler belt. You taught me that the things others see as flaws can be someone's greatest strengths. You showed me that love isn't a weakness, it's the most powerful force in the universe. Will you marry me? Tears streamed down Kira's face as she stared at the ring. In Zephyrian culture, we have no equivalent to human marriage. The concept of choosing a permanent bond based on emotion rather than strategic advantage. Jake's heart sank. If it's too foreign, if you don't want... Yes, Kira whispered, then louder. Yes, absolutely yes. Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, then swept her into his arms as she laughed and cried simultaneously. The kiss they shared was full of promise and joy and the certainty of a future together. I love you, Kira said against his lips. In any language, in any culture, I love you. I love you too, Jake replied, my magnificent, defective, perfect alien. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in Haven Station's multi-faith chapel, with Captain Torres from the Colonial Defense Force officiating. The ceremony blended human and Zephyrian traditions. Jake had researched ancient Zephyrian bonding rituals that predated the collective's sterile military culture. Kira wore a gown of flowing white fabric that caught the light like starshine, while Jake stood resplendent in his dress colonial uniform. As they exchanged vows, promising to stand together against whatever challenges the universe might bring, Jake thought about the storm-lashed planet where they'd first met. I wasn't worth the fuel, she'd said then. Now, as his wife, she was. Worth everything. The reception was a joyous affair with humans and aliens mingling freely. Jake's old Navy buddies traded stories with refugees Kira had counseled, while the station's diverse population celebrated the union of two people who'd found love across the species divide. Later, in the privacy of their quarters, Jake carried his bride across the threshold in the human tradition. What followed was a celebration of their love that surpassed even their desperate coupling on the mining station. This was different, unhurried, tender, full of the promise of all the nights to come. Jake worshipped Kira's body with reverent hands and lips, marveling at the way she responded to his touch. When she cried out his name, arching beneath him in ecstasy, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. Afterward, they lay entwined, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her skin. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked. "Leaving your world, your people?" "How can I regret finding my home?" Kira replied. "Besides, I didn't leave my people, I found them. Every refugee we help, every person who learns that empathy is strength, they're my people now." "Our people," Jake corrected. "Our people," she agreed. 1 year later, Jake stood in the nursery they'd prepared, watching Kira rock their daughter in her arms. Little Elena had her mother's luminous eyes and her father's stubborn chin, with skin that was a perfect blend of human pink and Zephyrian blue-gray. "She's perfect," Jake said, stroking the baby's downy hair. "She's everything they said was impossible," Kira said softly. "A hybrid, living proof that love transcends species, that connection is stronger than isolation. Think she'll have your empathy? I hope so. The universe needs more empathy, not less." Jake leaned down to kiss his wife and daughter, his heart full to bursting. Outside their quarters, the Meridian waited in the docking bay, ready for their next cargo run. They decided to continue flying together, exploring the galaxy with their daughter, showing her the wonders of a universe where different species could live and love together. As he looked at his family, Jake thought about the words that had brought them together. I wasn't worth the fuel. How wrong they'd been. Kira was worth everything, worth breaking regulations, worth fighting the collective, worth building a life that defied every assumption about the impossibility of interspecies love. She'd been abandoned as defective, but she'd become the foundation of something beautiful and new. Their love story was proof that the greatest treasures were often found in the most unlikely places, and that the things others discarded as worthless could become the most precious gifts of all. "Ready for our next adventure?" Jake asked as they prepared to depart Haven Station. "With you?" Kira smiled, settling Elena into her carrier. "I'm ready for anything." As the Meridian undocked and headed for the star lanes, the Morrison family set course for new horizons, carrying with them the proof that love could triumph over hatred, that compassion could defeat cruelty, and that sometimes the most broken things, when properly loved, became the most beautiful. Behind them, Haven Station grew smaller among the stars, but the home they'd built together traveled with them wherever they went. They were no longer running from the past. They were flying toward a future full of infinite possibilities. And in the cargo hold, alongside the usual freight, they carried the most precious cargo of all, hope for a universe where love knew no boundaries, where empathy was strength, and where everyone was worth saving.